Welcome to Creative Solutions for a New World Climate and Artists series. I'm Frances Littman, your host, and I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region from which I'm broadcasting and First Nations worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and water provide us to live, work, and play is due to the reciprocal relationships by which Coast Salish and the world's first people have lived and live today. We have a number of esteemed guests today who Jonathan O'Riordan, our community partner, will introduce. John is a former Deputy Minister of the Environment. He brings his years of experience to this series while keeping the legacy of his late wife, Gail O'Riordan, a beloved music teacher and professional cellist, alive. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Frances. Well, today we'll be discussing the much needed transformation in the Columbia Basin to restoring ecosystem values and preparing that basin to be resilient for a mid-21st century climate crisis. The original Columbia Basin Treaty was born in a completely different era that we have today. Although there are important economic benefits associated with flood control and power, these came at a terrible price to ecosystem values. But luckily, the drafters of the treaty built in an opportunity to renegotiate the treaty by 2024. And this offers a lifeline to breathe new life into the Columbia Basin. So today we're very fortunate to have two leading experts in the Columbia Treaty renegotiations. But before I introduce them, I just want to say a word about Kathy Eichenberger, who was supposed to be on this show, but unfortunately could not be because she's a public servant with the provincial government. And we recently had an election, and that means that public servants are unable to present publicly while the government is being sworn into the new regime. And that won't happen until the end of this month. So Kathy, I'm sure you're watching this show, and welcome, and I hope this makes you smile. So let me introduce our two guests. First is Barb Cosens, who is a professor of law and water policy at the University of Idaho. She's a member of the university consortium that has been advising the governments on the treaty negotiations. It's got a wealth of history and knowledge about the treaty, and it's got lots to contribute in today's discussion. And Chief Nathan Matthew with the Secwepemc First Nation, Shuswap Band in the Central Columbia in Canada, has played a leading role in the negotiations, advising the provincial government. And he is a strong leader in community-based solutions in natural and social resource management. So I'm going to start asking some questions of you both, starting with you, Bob. Maybe you can give us a brief history of what is the background to the treaty, what are the issues, what are the things that you think are top of mind when it comes to renegotiation?
Thank you, John. And thank you all for joining on this webinar. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining from the ancestral lands of the Nez Perce Nation. So the treaty was the International Joint Commission, which is set up by treaty between the United States and Canada, was asked to look for opportunities for joint benefits from development of the Columbia following World War II. And the treaty was ratified by the United States in 1961, and between 1961 and 64, British Columbia and the federal government of Canada underwent negotiations, which resulted in British Columbia being the operator of the treaty and the one to receive the benefits from it. And so it went into force on September 16th, 1964. And because it's hard to explain geographic things without pictures, I'm going to use a few pictures to illustrate what I'm talking about. So the joint benefits that they identified back in the 1960s were hydropower production and flood control. And so the treaty led to the building of the 3 dams you see stars by in Canada. And those dams were to be operated, first of all, for joint hydropower benefits. And so that cross section that shows the maple leaf or Canadian dams upstream and then the dams downstream in the United States is really good for illustrating what that is. Anytime water is released from a treaty dam, it goes through turbines at all of the dams downstream, and 50% of that added increment of power belongs to Canada. We call it the Canadian entitlement. The United States also paid $65 million up front for 60 years of what we call assured flood control. And it's that and nothing else that expires on September 16th, 2024. And so I think that the big question people ask is, that seems simple. The United States can just pay for more flood control, but there actually was a very, very broad review of the treaty, and then negotiations for a full sort of effort to modernize the treaty took place. And so why did that happen? It's because so much has changed since 1964. Energy markets changed substantially, and that really affected the Canadian entitlement. People thought that by today, hydropower would be much less valuable because with continued growth in energy, we need nuclear in order to provide the needs of the Pacific Northwest. But the energy crisis of the 1970s taught us that we couldn't conserve our way out of new power plants. And today, the hydropower system is not only as valuable as it was, but even more so because it's also a non-carbon source of energy. And that means that the value of the Canadian entitlement is high. It's not worth a small amount as we thought it might be. We also rely heavily on renewables within the basin now. So really have begun the switch to a non-carbon source of utility power. As John mentioned, one of the big issues is what all of this development, which really fueled the economic growth of the Pacific Northwest, has done to ecosystem health. And the slide on your left shows the listings of salmon and steelhead and resident species within the United States and where they are able to get to today. The slide on the right shows in pink areas that were traditional spawning habitat for the salmon and steelhead that are no longer accessible because of dams. So this isn't treaty dams. These are dams in the United States that prevent salmon from reaching 37% of their former habitat. But what's really the news in this story is we knew that would happen when we put the dams in. Now we care. And that's evidenced not only by the passage of the Endangered Species Act in the US and the Species at Risk Act in Canada, but just by the voices that have come to the table in the review. The map on the right was put together by the Native American tribes in the United States and the First Nations in Canada. And it shows the areas of interest to them where they are now blocked from salmon returning. And the power and the capacity of citizens within the basin to participate in a public process has completely changed and changed the entire dialogue. The other thing is the other topic of this discussion, which is climate. We're already seeing a change, and the two maps on the left of your screen show that our projections are we won't see a huge change in precipitation, but because of temperature going up, we'll see sort of a drying out of the basin because a lot more water is consumed in vegetation growth and evaporation. And that's what leads to increasing wildfire seasons, as we saw this year. And what the slide on the right shows is something that goes to any system where your hydropower, flood control, and salmon runs depend on the timing of flow. And what it shows is that it's happening earlier and earlier. The big spring runoff that used to wash smolts out to the sea. And that's because at the lower latitudes, so mostly in the United States, we're changing from a snow-dominated system to a rain-dominated system. So rain, rather than serving as natural storage, just runs off. And so that really affects how you might operate the system for additional purposes.
Well, thanks very much, Barb. One of the points that we need to emphasize that before any of the dams were built on the Columbia in the 1930s, the Columbia was perhaps one of the top salmon producing streams in North America. And we had salmon flowing all the way from Portland up well into Canada, up the main stem of the Columbia. But the dams that were created in the 1930s before the treaty effectively blocked all of that salmon migration into Canada. And now we have very little other than up the Similkameen Valley into the Okanagan. So Nathan, I've got two questions for you. The first one is, I understand that the three nations in Canada signed a letter of agreement with the federal and Canadian and BC governments to look at ways in which we could return salmon to the Canadian Columbia. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and what your hopes are about that agreement?
Good morning. Glad to be here and to be part of the conversation. The salmon is a big issue for First Nations, and I think on the list of issues to be dealt with, it's always at the top or very near the top. The reintroduction of salmon. It was so important to our lifestyle and our ability to successfully live in the Columbia Basin. It was essential, and so the dams really did a number on the salmon, but there's that specific issue that is being handled separately from the ecological and cultural values initiatives. So there's a very specific agreement, and the three nations are involved, the federal government, the province, and their intent is to reintroduce salmon. And of course, there are a lot of challenges to that, but because it's so important, they've all made a very firm commitment to do that. And we know it's possible in terms of technology nowadays of getting the adults over the dams going upstream, and of course there's the young salmon going downstream. There's ways of optimizing their survival, but it's not easy. It's one of the most complex things that's going to happen as a result of these commitments, is to actually have salmon come back, and how the system has to change to accommodate that happening is something that's to be determined. Like how will operations of the system be accommodating to salmon, and that's the rising and lowering of levels within the reservoirs, the speed of the water, the velocity, the temperature, and all of the pieces that are required to successfully have the salmon come up several hundred kilometers and go back to the ocean and come back again. So it's a really great challenge. And everyone is optimistic, given continued commitment. It's relatively expensive, and it's certainly depending a lot on science and research. So all of that is happening, and as we go into the next year and two, there will be more, recommendations coming from that group in terms of how to operate the system to the advantage of salmon. So that's we're looking forward to that.
Well, that'll be a wonderful testimony to the renewed Columbia if we can find some way of getting salmon back into Canada. But Nathan, maybe it's important for the viewers to know that although the Canadian portion of the Columbia represents only 15% of the total basin, it provides at least 50% of the flows in flood years. And so the dams in Canada are critical to holding back water at key times to enable the US portion of the Columbia to develop on the floodplain. And as Bob mentioned, the big difference in 2024 is that guaranteed flood control arrangement has to be changed. It was only bought and paid for to 2024. So the renegotiations have to figure out ways in which the flood control can proceed beyond 2024. And that leads to how we manage reservoir levels. And a key factor in ecosystem values from your First Nations viewpoint, Nathan, is how do we avoid some of these massive drawdowns in the Arrow Lakes and Kinbasket that are changing the values that you First Nations revere? And what are the ways of trading off some of the losses for power and flood control to make some kind of a compromise that meets your interests? Can you comment on that a bit?
I think that's at the crux of the renegotiation of the treaty between Canada and the U.S. How to change the purpose from flood control and power generation to more appropriately, and we think appropriately, put in there the purpose of ecosystem support and the support of cultural values, the interests and needs of Indigenous First Nations people. So that is, we're going to be getting to that point in a very short period of time, because we're getting input in terms of ecosystem issues and how do you maximize the wildlife, the birds, the insects, all that are to strengthen food chains and the relative health of plant and animal species within the basin. So the research is being pretty well wrapped up, and we will put that into a modeling program that will, if we want to do something for the birds and it involves raising the level of the reservoirs or trying to cool off the river system, then that will happen and it'll be modeled. And we can stand back and look at it. And then the choices can be made, because that will intersect with the current operation that is necessary to prevent flooding or to maximize power generation, because the system right now is fine-tuned to only those two purposes. So the purposes will change, I believe. And we're going to see what kind of effects that we have on those original two purposes when we introduce ecosystems and cultural values. So we're looking forward to that. And from what we can see, just looking at, let's say, the Kinbasket Reservoir, which is massive, if we have a little bit of change in the level of reservoir, or the reservoir level at different times of the year, that's going to have a real significant impact on the retention of water to prevent flooding, or the having enough water to actually maximize power generation when the prices and the needs are there. So yeah, there's going to be some pretty significant information coming down, and then there's going to be choices to make. And of course, those of us that are involved with that will be making recommendations to the negotiations side of things, and eventually it will make its way onto the negotiating table with the United States.
I think it's important for folks to know that BC has signed the UNDRIP principles, the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights. And so all of the three First Nations in Canada are now formally observers to the treaty negotiations. They're fully engaged with the Canadian treaty negotiations on the issues at stake. As Nathan has outlined, they've got a lot of opportunity to put in their cultural values, their ecosystem values, their desires and aspirations. And these are now taken seriously. So to me, it's a fairly good example of informed consent, where the Indigenous groups are actively engaged in the negotiating side. But I'm not quite sure if that's the same in the States. So Bob, I'm going to turn back to you and ask you to comment on two things. One is, what are the kinds of ecosystem values that the States might be willing to incorporate into a renewed treaty? And what is the role of the tribes in the States in terms of advising negotiators on your side of the border?
Sure. So to talk about sort of what the efforts are in terms of ecosystem, I have one last picture. And this shows even better in, ironically, a salmon color, the area of the basin that is blocked from salmon runs that were there previously. And so it really shows the blockage from dams in the United States to salmon runs in the main stem of the Columbia. Well, as I noted before, and as Nathan noted, that view has changed. And although the tribes have always consistently had that view, they've now been joined by many others. In 2015, a group we call the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which is an entity formed between Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, amended their fish and wildlife program. They have two programs. One is the energy planning for the basin, and one is a fish and wildlife program. They amended it to investigate reintroducing salmon into these blocked portions and tributaries in the United States, but including the main stem up into Canada. So I think you have much broader support for this effort now than ever in the past. And a lot of studies are taking place into nutrients and habitat to make sure that if reintroduced, salmon could survive and spawn in these habitats. As was indicated, the survival of salmon also goes to how quickly the juveniles can get back to sea. So if you look at the blue part of the map, the area in Idaho is really the main cold water refugia remaining for salmon until we can get them back into Canada. And that's the Salmon and Clearwater rivers. It used to take 2 weeks to get to the sea from those headwaters. It now takes 2 months. That means that fish are expending energy swimming in slack water behind dams. It means they're subject to prey, and it means they're subject to higher temperatures, which are lethal for these species. For several decades, there has been discussion about removing those 4 dams you see in Washington that are on the Snake River, the part of the river that comes up into Idaho, the tributary, which are Army Corps of Engineer dams. They have locks for shipping, which makes Lewiston, Idaho, one of the farthest inland ports on the West Coast, the farthest inland on the West Coast. And they also produce hydropower. And there have been proposals for some time to remove those dams because of the barriers they present, not just to migration up, but to moving smolts out quickly. And that's been, up until now, your typical United States polarized argument where one side saying remove the dams, they're killing the fish. The other side saying the dams are essential to jobs and to getting agricultural products to market. So jobs versus the environment. But I'm an academic, I'm not party to any of these discussions, but what you hear in public panels and what you hear in the rhetoric is a significant change in that dialogue in the last 2 years. And the change is something as a mediator, I recognize as being indicating people are actually seriously thinking about this now. One is that people are actually seriously looking at, well, if we got rid of the hydropower on those 4 dams, which are small dams, it's not a huge amount of hydropower, but it's a significant percentage. How can we replace it with carbon-free sources? The second thing they've been looking at is how do you ensure a viable economy for Lewiston if you remove its port? And Lewiston is a rural, poor town. It's on the edge of the Nez Perce Reservation, has a very high population of Native American. It has two sources of jobs, a pulp mill and the port. So what do you do to make it viable if you take this out? And people are actually seriously looking into that. And then finally, how do you ensure low-cost transportation for agricultural products in Idaho and Eastern Washington to ports if this is removed? And so I think that's a really important development that's being seriously discussed because it's strictly in the United States. It's not part of the treaty, but would have huge impacts for the viability of salmon, which could be part of the treaty. And then finally, if you look at the 2 pictures on the right, these also go to the fact that today, well, not today, starting in late January, when we change administrations in the United States, you will have administrations on both sides of the border that are looking towards carbon neutrality. And you will also have people looking for innovative ways to do what's called distribute flood control. And so one of those things for carbon sequestration and for natural storage of flood is to reconnect the river to the floodplain. We have a lot of the river, main stem of the river, that's in a gorge, so there's no opportunity there. But on tributaries and on parts of the river, there's huge opportunity. And what this particular picture shows is on the top is an area near the Columbia River estuary that had a levee for flood control. And then it's the same place on the bottom where the river's been reconnected to the floodplain. And so these sorts of opportunities for joint benefits, natural flood control, carbon sequestration, I would hope are being looked into more seriously as negotiations go forward, but also the other efforts at restoration on both sides of the border.
Thanks, Bob. Just one further comment before we pass on to our next guest. But right now, form follows function in terms of governance of the treaty. So the treaty was based in 1960 on flood control and power. So the governance is by utilities, BC Hydro on the Canadian side and the Bonneville Power Authority on the US, plus the US Corps of Engineers dealing with flood control. I think it's fair to say, though, that with the introduction of ecosystem values as a main value and objective of a new treaty, there will have to be a change in this governance structure. And I believe, at least I think Canada is looking at different models that would bring in different players. But maybe quickly, Nathan, you can talk about what you see as the role of your Indigenous colleagues in a new governance model so that they're fully represented under UNDRIP principles.
Yeah, we're moving into that area in terms of the governance, and we've struck a working group in that area, and we're just moving in the next couple of months in the determination of what aspects of the operation of the Columbia River Treaty would we have an interest in, or maybe a right to participate in decision making. So that's happening as we speak. So we look forward to a fulsome discussion with, this is domestic, with Canada and BC Hydro in how do the Indigenous side, how do we sit in the decision-making room about how the system is to be operated, and providing some kind of guidance or oversight, or become part of the authority structure. So it's happening, and I guess that's one of the interesting aspects of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We have the declaration. Canada and BC have both signed on to that, and they're both developing legislation or change their legislation to support the notion that Indigenous people have rights, have a right to sit in the room in terms of decision making about how the lands and resources are to be used. So we'll see, and there's a couple of places where a free, prior, and informed consent is mentioned, and we're fully looking forward to how we can make sure that the intent of the United Nations Declaration is fulfilled within the relationship that we have with the province, the federal government, and BC Hydro, in terms of seeing this whole piece as part of a real reconciliation of the rights, the title, the authority, the governance between the different governing groups. So we're looking forward to that, and we're wrestling with it. So it's a good place to be, but nothing has been decided, and that's, I guess, part of the negotiation and part of the experience with the renewal of the Columbia River Treaty.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob and Nathan, for that. I can ask you to stand by for a few minutes because we're going to move on to the collaborative monitoring program. But before I do, I just hope the viewers see that we really have an opportunity to change a somewhat biased treaty in 1960s to economic development to one that is much more multifaceted, dealing with ecosystem values in a more balanced way than economics, and shared values across the border. So it's really an exciting time to be engaged in Columbia and see how it's transforming itself to deal with this massive change in climate and hydrology over the next 50 years. So well worth tracking if you're in this school of business. So let me turn to the folks who are doing the collaborative monitoring. Because part of Climate and the Arts series has been to emphasize the role of community groups engaged in looking at creative solutions to the way we manage our resources. And Kat Harwig, who is the executive director for Living Lakes Canada, is heading up a group of scientists who are looking not just at the Columbia Tree, but all of the rivers and lakes of the Columbia Basin in Canada, how they function, what is their health, and what can be done to improve them and make them more resilient to a changing climate. So she and her team of researchers have been working in this area for many, many years. And it's a great pleasure, Kat, to introduce you to this seminar and to get you to outline what you're doing in Living Lakes and introduce your colleagues. So away you go.
Great, thanks very much, John. Really appreciate, we really do appreciate being invited to this series. You and Francis have made a very interesting opportunity for us to sit and watch this during these COVID times. So I appreciate that and thank you. And I'm actually calling from Invermere today. So it's the traditional Ktunaxa territory and the territory of the Shuswap Indian Band. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues today, which is Santiago Botero, who does the management for the Monitoring Collaborative Data Hub, and he'll speak to you afterwards. And then Raegan Mallinson, who's responsible for training and the on-the-ground monitoring. And so I just would like to provide you sort of an overview of what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing. Our grassroots water stewardship work in the Columbia Basin started about 2004 with the Lake Windermere project. And much of our work has become a grassroots template for monitoring water-based ecosystems throughout the basin, BC, and other parts of Canada. And our mission with Living Lakes Canada is to normalize water stewardship. We believe that community-based water monitoring is a way to empower localized climate adaptation, as well as providing support to regionally based decision-making by helping fill important water data gaps. So in 2006, the Pacific Climate Change Consortium provided a report for the Columbia Basin Trust outlining the relative urgent need for water data to be collected beyond what was required for the Columbia River Treaty. So in order to build more climate resilient communities throughout the basin, and in 2017, another CBT report entitled Water Monitoring and Climate in the Upper Columbia Basin, a summary of current status and opportunity, also identified significant water knowledge gaps. So we took the recommendations of the 2017 CBT report very much to heart, and it was the premise for us hosting an international conference in Invermere. And this report was also the guiding rationale for our establishment of the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Collaborative and Open Source Data Hub. So, and then this summer, Living Lakes hosted a workshop to establish an overarching science-based approach to help guide the direction for the monitoring priorities, hydrologically based. And so there was consensus among the senior hydrologists attending the workshop that a water balance approach be the guiding framework for a hydrological monitoring in each of the basin's 10 sub-hydrological regions. So a water balance approach would allow for subsequent water budgeting needs to be developed. And we're also working with local and regional governments and First Nations staff to better understand what their short, medium, and long-term water monitoring needs are, so we can build synergies and help coordinate the water monitoring efforts of the 30 groups throughout the Columbia Basin who are currently doing water monitoring. So this water monitoring effort for communities to become more climate resilient and better understanding their own watershed health in anticipating and adapting to long-term diminished water flows and short-term flood events. So we just feel that in this sort of climate crisis era, that we really do need to have all hands on deck in order to begin to shift paradigms and build efficient collaborations to creatively unite our efforts to address these challenges. And so I'd like to pass it on to Santiago now, who is managing our database and helping the 30 monitoring groups within the Columbia Basin upload their data sets to the open source, open access data hub. So thanks very much. Short and sweet, Santiago, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kat, for those insights and introduction. And thank you, John and Francis, for having us today. It's a great pleasure. As you all know, my name is Santiago, and I'm database manager here at Living Lakes, Canada. And I'm based out of Casigar, which is within the traditional territories of the Sanaix, Silks, Tanaha, and Secwepemc peoples, where I have the honor to also go to school at Silker College, doing a geographic information systems program. I want to talk to you today about data. And as you know, water takes many, many shapes. And so it is just expected that water data is going to be just as dynamic. And so within the Columbia Basin, water data takes the shapes of glaciers, snow, streams, rivers, lakes, aquifers, wetlands, and even the riparian ecosystems that surround them. And so the Columbia Basin Water Hub really aims to be a container or a water bottle for all that water knowledge. We're working to ensure that data collected through the monitoring efforts that Kat was talking about before has a home for systematic storage, display, and access of data, as well as providing detailed information on that data, or what is known as metadata. Open data and collaboration is clearly a focus, as community groups within the basin have a deep sense of place, and their passion about this area is what drives their desire to protect and monitor a resource through the collection of water quality and water quantity of the water bodies that I was mentioning before. The Water Hub, therefore, is able to support varying levels of data users via our Open Data Hub, as well as there's so many open things, open source software, and as well as collaboration. So our water container, as we have the open approach, we decided to go with CCAN, which is an open source database system that provides the ability for us to store, provide, and display any different kind of data. So whether that's CSVs, PDFs, anything like that, we'll be able to have it there. It's going to be a central place for information, mainly in order for us to support the creation of water budgets and land use choices, as well as climate change studies by researchers, decision makers, and the civil society as a whole. We also have a variety of tools that make it really engaging for our database and the users, such as the map search feature and being able to filter through data to download only specific amounts of the data set, or as well as graphing some of the data. And what I'm most excited about is the fact that we took a network and organizations approach where each organization and monitoring group is really able to have governance within that data. And so through that governance of the groups, we really aim to create resiliency and data governance for communities for both First Nations and non-First Nations. And by creating a network of data uploaders and water stewards, the Water Hub combines efforts for water monitoring within the Columbia Basin while increasing a water literate constituency and empower people to work and engage in watershed health through collaborative, open source, and transparent approach. And ultimately, the Water Hub will be empty without the continuous effort of monitoring our waterways. So now I'd like to introduce my coworker, Raegan, who is a program manager at Living Lakes, Canada, and we'll talk about some of those water monitoring efforts.
Thank you, Santiago, and thanks, Kat. So I'm program manager with Living Lakes, Canada, and I'm tuning in today from North Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. So I'm going to talk about some of our ecosystem monitoring today. So at Living Lakes, we use a method called CABIN, which is the Canadian Aquatic Biomonitoring Network. And it was developed by the federal government and uses benthic macroinvertebrates, so the small bugs on the bottom of the stream, to indicate water health. And so Living Lakes has been teaching academia, industry, government, and Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and water stewardship groups in the basin these water monitoring protocols for the last 15 years. And we've also been involved in protocol updates, such as our project with the University of Guelph and testing the efficacy of environmental DNA within these CABIN methods. And so I'm going to share a couple examples of the projects that we were working on this year with local groups in the Columbia Basin. So we worked in partnership with the Friends of Kootenay Lake, and we trained their volunteers in the CABIN methods to assess the stream health of tributaries going into the west arm of Kootenay Lake. And so with this standardized and scientifically credible data, these community groups are able to upload their data into the Monitoring Collaborative Data Hub that Santiago just finished speaking about, as well as the federal CABIN database. We're also very grateful to be part of a project under the leadership of the Shuswap Band and in partnership with the Columbia Wetlands Stewardship Partnership. And so this project does pre-restoration monitoring using those benthic samples for tributaries to the Columbia wetlands. And the project is called the Columbia Headwaters Aquatic Restoration Secwepemc Strategy. And the goal of the project is to restore the form and function of aquatic and riparian ecosystems to those Columbia wetlands. So this is a really great project that we're excited to be a part because it will help prioritize which streams need restoration the most in the Columbia wetland system, and then also provide that really critical baseline data collection so that when the restoration is complete, we can see how successful the project was. So Living Lakes Canada has been working extensively in the Columbia Basin. We work with 3 First Nations and currently have 2 signed memorandums of understanding with Ktunaxa bands. We also work, I've talked a lot about rivers, but we also work really in depth with lakes and with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, updating their foreshore inventory mapping protocol. And this is a really great project because it works with communities to create lake management plans, which are then in turn fed into their official community plans. And this is exciting because the province is now using this to feed into information for the Columbia River Treaty. This is just like a really quick overview of some of the projects Living Lakes Canada is doing in the Columbia Basin. So if you have any questions, there's our contact information. Thank you so much for having us. It's great to see all this information and efforts being done in the basin. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was incredible. That was just so informative. And now I think it's time to answer some questions. Is everybody ready with that? Nicola asks, is there an opportunity to frame the treaty under a human security framework?
Certainly, when we talk about human security, I'm not quite sure of that term, how it's used generally speaking, but when we talk about sort of the Indigenous security, I think that's what we're looking for, is that in order to live healthy lives within our culture, where we can speak our language, where we sing our songs, where we can be self-governing. To me, that's Indigenous security, is that we have the security to be ourselves and to exist in this world as Indigenous people, and to have it supported and recognized. So the discussions we're having now are just part of a very large discussion. It's not, we're not just confining that discussion about Indigenous security to the Columbia River Treaty. It's happening all over the place. And I think the promise that's been presented by the Canada and by British Columbia is that they will change their legislation to more closely reflect their rights and responsibilities that we have within the United Nations Declaration. That's a very large piece of work. And what we're doing here, hopefully, is reflective of that. When we're secure that we can have our voices heard, where we can support our health and well-being, and where we can have a say in how the lands and resources within our territories are being used. And to have relationships that are reciprocal. So yeah, so I guess there's lots to say about it, but yeah, it's a big story.
I was just going to say that leads into the question about how can the First Nations of each basin state cooperate together across international borders?
I think early on, when we started talking about the Columbia River Treaty, and of course, we were thinking about Canada, but it wasn't very long before we were having a dialogue with the US tribes, and finding that they have such a similar background, culture, history, that we had lots to talk about. And of course, the importance of the Columbia River system was huge. The development of the Columbia River Treaty on our side has been the largest single infringement of our lives, on our rights, that ever happened, and amongst a whole lot of other tough things. And so it's the same in the US. And so there's a lot of discussion between the tribes in the US and the First Nations in BC to work together. I mean, and one of the key ideas that we work with is it's one river. It's not a series of reservoirs and pieces, segments of a system that's tuned up to do flood control and hydropower. So getting back to that sort of a big idea that it's a one river, and how do we treat it like that? Is that what happens in the mountains and the glaciers is going to affect everything that happens downstream, and what happens down at the mouth of the Columbia is going to have impacts upstream. So I think that idea, we have lots to talk about. And of course, we share so many issues with non-Indigenous neighbors with regard to the environment. That whole idea of ecosystem, it wasn't invented by the English language. We have words for that that drive sort of the principles of our governance and our relationships amongst ourselves and our relationship to the world, the natural world that we live in. And that's the same as a whole lot of others. So we have a very good opportunity to talk with individuals that have interests in the natural world, whether I'm now getting used to ecosystem, but there's nothing strange about it. And the discussion we're having that we haven't had maybe before was taking a look at the climate change and considering really big ideas in terms of what does a ton of carbon represent. That's certainly new to most of us. So lots to talk about and lots to learn from one another, especially from the scientific side and the research that we're doing. It's good to be included in all of the gathering of information about how the system works in terms of the ecosystem and how the fragmenting has happened over time, and what are the possibilities and the potential of sort of closing some of those gaps, because they are huge when you look at the operations of the system. So yeah.
Thank you.
Forget what the question was.
That's okay. You did a fine job of presenting information that's very valuable. Tom asked, what will be the capital cost of dam modifications to achieve the goals, and how will that funding be apportioned? When might this work begin?
It's just a comment that the Outdoor Recreation Council in BC noted that there's a dam on the Secwepemc River, which is part of the Columbia Basin, not technically part of the treaty, that is in the States, but is blocking a large amount of salmon spawning habitat in Canada. And so there's a fair push right now. And the dam itself is 1950s, it's long past its due date. So there's a big pressure to remove that dam and open up a large amount of spawning for Columbia salmon to come up the Secwepemc and into Canada. So that's a kind of transformative change I think we might see in the Columbia as we move forward, make it a much more resilient system.
Great. And I'm just going to keep moving here we have so many questions. How is the data for maintaining the health of rivers and streams fed into improving practices in forestry, agriculture, mining, and other industries? Santiago, is that over to you?
So that's the holy grail. That's what we are going to try hard and develop, is how can we track these data sets, right? We don't want to just monitor for monitoring. That's a waste of resources and a waste of time. And so we really want to be able to begin tracking those data sets, right? So if we collected here, it was because we needed it for the community. So the community highlighted it as an area of importance for whatever X and Y project. And so then we collect the data, and then we know that that data is going to be applied specifically to that piece of policy, whether it be a community plan or whatever, or how something is forested or harvested, for example. And so by having an approach where you're monitoring with reason and applying it directly to policy, then things start to change. And then you can also get into more ideas that are a little bit more out there and borrow from other parts, such as Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, where there are little identifiers that show that this was in fact done this by this person, it was reviewed by all these different people. And so if you start having this kind of little identifiers for data, we can more easily track and then apply them as we show that this data is number one of quality, and we try to do that through metadata, so the information on what data sets we have and how it was collected as well, so that we make sure that they meet both provincial and national water quality and quantity collection standards. And so it's really combining the efforts, really, first of all, to aim the monitoring, and second of all, to provide all that data in a very nice package. So people don't like to deal with the numbers.
So I guess that answers the question. Since you're teaching volunteers to gather data, you're ensuring that the data has fidelity and that you're getting accurate data by doing it this way, correct?
Yeah, that will go a little bit over with Raegan, where since we're applying this standard methods of collection, we're really standardizing the data altogether as well. And by having one place, then people are able to review it later on for quality control and quality assurance.
Mm-hmm. Great. Raegan, did you want to add anything?
Sure, Santiago nailed it on the head, but the benefit of the cabin methods that I was talking about is that it's a network. So everyone collecting data is benefiting everyone else. And so the efforts really are collaborative. And then for the foreshore inventory mapping data, that can be performed on any lake. So all of the methods that we're using are not only scientifically credible, but they're exportable to any rivers and lakes. So just a matter of getting people out on them.
Excellent. Someone asked, what species of salmon come up or will come up through the river, the Columbia River? Just curious.
Well, most of the Pacific salmon species, they all come up the Columbia. It's very similar to the Fraser system.
We have 13 salmon and steelhead runs that are listed in the US. So it's, we have steelhead, which are very equivalent to trout, except they're anadromous. We have Chinook, sockeye salmon, and then splitting them down into the various runs is why there's 13 listings. So there might be 4 different runs of Chinook that are listed. So they're divided both by seasonal and by species.
Okay, thank you. Colin asks, what new regional governance structures are needed to support disparate ecological monitoring groups and provide long-term continuity and commitment?
Yeah, I can address that in part. So one of the things we've done is there's a national roundtable for community-based water monitoring, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And we did form a roundtable in Ottawa and made 60 recommendations to the federal government on how they can support community-based water monitoring so that we are more cohesive, and using, provincially and federally accredited protocols as well. And just making sure that we support, these initiatives within community to help empower communities to steward their own watersheds. So that's an initiative that we're also trying to move forward into the developing Canadian Water Agency. And as well, the same dialogue is happening at the provincial level. So we're working on it.
How confident are you in the commitment of all levels of government in the process of the reevaluation? Like, here we are 30 years later. Do you hope that the negotiations and discussions will result in action from the various governments?
I'd have to say I'm very confident. I think that, speaking from the Canadian side, that I know personally most of the negotiators, and they're strong people with a good background, good science, good understanding of public administration and governance issues. And I think they've developed a very strong approach to renegotiating the treaty that brings in ecosystem restoration, but still allows for shared values on flood control and power. So I think that the treaty that will come out of the negotiations before 2024 will be a much stronger and more flexible document than the one we've got right now. So there'll be a big improvement.
That's great. We have to stay focused on what we want. And with that, we have so many great questions, but of course we're running low on time. But as we always promise everybody, when we post this video, we'll post answers to the questions that we didn't have time today to answer. So please hang in there and know that next week when we send out our newsletter, you'll have that information and the links that you need. So thank you, everyone, for a wonderfully informative program. And next Wednesday, November 25th, is our last program for this calendar year. We'll be back in the new year, and instead of weekly programs, we will be offering 2 programs a month, and there's lots of other exciting things cooking, let me tell you. In the meantime, we encourage you to visit creativelyunited.org and feast on the wealth of information and videos to be found there. And please be sure you are signed up for our newsletters, which you can do on the Creatively United website. And we would also like to thank our amazing artists, Gennady Imanoff and Bob Haverluck, for contributing their evocative work for our banners and posters for this year's series. We're most grateful to them and to you and our audience for tuning in. And John, now, would you like to tell us more about next week's final program for the year?
Sure. Next week is the season 2 finale, to use the Netflix conundrum, but Bob and Francis and I will all participate in a review of what we've done and also what we think is coming up important for the 2021 series. Bob will start to address things such as methane release from the Arctic areas, which is a big issue relative to changing carbon in the atmosphere. And he'll be talking about how artists, both visual and musical, are changing the messages to deal with the crisis in a more effective manner. We're hoping that Mace Rosenstein will join us and bring us up to date with what a new Biden administration will bring to the climate agenda, both nationally and internationally. And Francis, you're going to talk about the role of collective consciousness and changing the way people see the world. And how
it's going to be a rich program, John.
And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to rewild ecosystems in BC across Canada to make for high levels of carbon sequestration. And to top it off, we're going to have a cameo presentation by my twin brother, Tim, and his colleague from the Norfolk Parish Councils, talking about the ways in which parish councils in Britain are beginning to take charge of the climate agenda over there. And finally, we've got our youth panel led by Katia Bannister, who will talk about what their views are for the new series in 2021. What a wonderful program. And we'll have a secret musical guest to sign us off with a wonderful musical performance.
All that in 1 hour.
All that in 1 hour.
It's going to be amazing. So we are very grateful to our panelists. Thank you so much. Grateful to our audience. And thank you everyone for tuning in and sharing these important videos with your friends, family, coworkers, and your networks. Keep them circulating, and thanks so much. See you next week. Bye for now, everyone. Thank you.